It's a difficult notion, even though it's used as though it were easy, even by psychoanalysts. But in any event, if there's any truth to it, that's part of what's being metabolized, I think, in some of these doubling relations at the center of our sci-fi complex. Because there's always an internal relation that's being carried forward each time we externalize somehow or other and simulate the doubling drive, the doubling and dividing drive.
And then the transitional object is not only limited to this particular moment of child development, but it could be a kind of frame which could be reapplied throughout and also applied in macro things. So it becomes a fetishistic object to a degree.
Well, this is our argument with Winnicott. It's Lacan's argument, it's probably my argument, and that is he divorces the fetish from the transitional object. He sees, or at least he separates the content of hopefulness that is so basic to his affirmation of the antisocial child, at least. He separates that from the fetish. Remember, the fetish is the consolidation of the antisocial behavior that is no longer unconscious, but through secondary gain has turned itself into the material that one has to master over and over again, and which gives one a certain satisfaction in that mastery. Now has taken on a separate existence, which he would argue is untreatable, unreachable. It's no longer the transitional object. But why, Lacan would ask, on his terms, but I would argue also in Freudian terms, why would that be the case, necessarily? So just for the sake of being a scholar now, I just have to point out that he doesn't include the fetish. It's coming out of the transitional object. It's a classic notion of sublimation. Like I say, it extends in developmental time through play, and then is the very essence of cultural interest, which is thus motivated as the hub and respite that keeps us functioning and remote from the suicidal option yet another way. So what I propose we do next is I will talk a little bit about Frankenstein and Dracula, perhaps. And I wanted to turn to the film Dark City, because those of you familiar with the film remember some of the details of the film will hopefully recognize that it could be identified as a film that we've been working towards to find our hypotheses, our genealogy somehow informed or reflected by. That might be too much to ask, but I'd like to look at a long thing from Dark City. Okay, we'll break. Arrangement, which is the most historical, as it were, of Dick's various manipulations, techno-psycho-manipulations of time and time travel, that it's illusory. The extension into the properly historical past is something of an illusion, as we keep on falling short of any influence on the historical past. What we discover instead are the links and limits of a remembrance that is closer to home, which is the usually the explicit medium of Dick's investigations. Now, all of this, let me just say before we take a break, all of this is based on Dick's set up for himself from the start, really, of this writing, anyway, as far as we can follow that start. He set up at the beginning of his writing and being the loss of his twin sister, Jane. His twin sister died shortly after their double birth, and it's something that he would return to in conversation several times each day. It's something he really lived with, and it certainly returns explicitly, thematically in many works, not in this particular one. But the argument, the mythic, psychotic argument, the impression he took away from that origin of remembrance for him is ultimately the deregulation of the transitive sentencing of loss. So we tend, however, naively to think about survivors and the one lost. But he argued that there is no way to decide who lost whom. At the moment of loss, each loses the other. And it is deluded not to see that as ongoing. So he was inspired always not to be sure whether he was the memory that his sister harbored of her dead brother, or what have you. He occupied that moment of undecidability as to who was gone, which keeps that relationship ongoing for the duration of remembrance, extended through the recent past. That is what makes science fiction allegorical. Okay, please think about that while we have a break. We'll come back to that if there are any further questions or responses. And then we'll use our remaining time together to consider a clip from Albert or let go down. Okay? I'm going to have to make yet another last-minute change because there was a particular trajectory I wanted to follow out from Simulacrum 3 through Fassbinder's film version that I discovered last night that my copy doesn't have English subtitles. No. There's too much talking going on, so I'm not going to go in that direction. I'll just say right now, identify where we're not going, and that was, or would be, the German interest in this particular American science fiction, because there isn't the same interest in it in the States. I think it was only published once. They went through a great many editions in German translation. It was the occasion for Fassbinder's made-for-TV, two-part made-for-TV movie, Welt am Draht. I guess we're all on a wire or something. It was recently reintroduced in New York because they fixed up the print. And that
you can get it, download it with English subtitles. Oh no, this is the last thing. There are torrents for it.
Well, you all can look.
Came out in England.
The reason, what's otherwise interesting about the film is you can see that Fassbinder doesn't even consider the curious metaphysics downloaded in the novel itself. We'll get to that in a moment. Whereas the remake of the film, The 13th Floor, not directed by Emmerich, but Emmerich was the producer and very much identified with the project, the director of Universal Soldier, for example, as well as a film you might know, Independence Day, thank you. That science fiction thriller. So in a way, even that film is somehow Germanic. So there's this German investment in the narrative, at least as adaptation for two large film projects. And that was the part that interested me, and I'm just going to tell you why, because we're not perhaps going to go there. And that is that, as you saw, hopefully, via the excerpts that I made available, the fantasy gets to our themes of psychosis and technologization and Dublin and so on and so forth, but puts in the foreground something we might call marketing research. That's interesting because that was the only available model for what was first called propaganda during World War I. And the Americans were considered to be very good at it. Just for the sake of completion, I should just mention that Freud's own nephew, Edward Bernays, was one of the key figures in New York in pursuing the connection between various kinds of marketing psychology. Polling as a science, as it were, begins in the 20s in the United States. And based on the implicit ability to manipulate through this kind of research, the Americans staged what was then the only successful propaganda around. So when the Germans, after World War I, said that they had lost the war on psychological grounds, they didn't just pick that up and develop it, as it were, but then, for reasons that I've indicated, invested directly in psychoanalysis. So it's an interesting document, because even the figure who, at crisis point, comes closest to a psychoanalytic perspective on what he refers to as pseudo-paranoia, is identified as a behaviorist. He's a psychological counselor working on this project of determining opinion in the direction of consumer production. He works on that as psychological counselor, but he feels a behaviorist mode. Certainly the series of simulation, although at first we only know one simulation, but the relationship to the simulation is as at a cocktail party at the start of the novel says through a slip, stimulation. It's about stimuli and response in the beginning. And then something else takes over. And that taking over, I think, can be seen in Fassbinder's film. But anyway, we're changing course slightly. Because I couldn't show you the DVD I brought with me anyway. I want to start out with where we left off kind of last time with Tom Zimmer. We turn to the question of choice in Dublin, in simul identification, say. I guess we kind of have a consensus that there is little choice ultimately. But first I want to ask, how is it possible that Freud would consider the robot Olympia an instance of Dublin? That's a question. You all understand, we didn't read the story together, but there's suddenly this robot girl, and the relationship between the robot girl and Nathaniel, the protagonist, who's gradually undergoing a complete psychotic break. That relationship is referred to as a relationship of doubling by Freud. Why? I mean, we can understand doubling when one looks like the other, or when it's based on the mirror image. But what is meant by doubling in this instance, do you think?
It's not a physical doubling, obviously, but it's a psychological doubling. So the girl has got her past form and her present form, and Nathaniel is going through a change. So there's a before and after.
That's an interesting way to put it. In other words, there's one could say that there's no such thing as a robot being that isn't at some point the double of a model. That would already qualify it as constitutively its own double, for lack of a better word. But getting back to things we said about technologization needing to include some sense of the ready positioning for the reception of actual technologies or actual doubles. I think what Freud means is it's that ready positioning that's being mirrored in the relationship. So Nathaniel is able to receive the robot dolly because he's still in that dyadic position. So it's that his the dyadic relationship that he carries with him that's doubled in the robot relationship. So I just threw that out to see how even at the closest quarters, namely Freud on doubling in the romantic story, we have a kind of diversification of how we need to understand the doubling relationship. As I said last time, we seem to have come, we were at a consensus, it seemed, that you couldn't choose a simulated self, for example, that wasn't, or didn't have, at least after the fact, a kind of inner world connection. So Klein would argue, for example, in her reading, in her essay on identification, which is a reading of Julian Green's novel If I Were You, which is a novel about body switching. She argues or thinks that the novel shows at the same time that the seeming random choice of the protagonist of new bodies to inhabit always over time leads to some kind of recognition of a part of himself that he had discarded. This is the full frame of what Klein referred to as projective identification. A special way of thinking about splitting. She introduced through this notion that we also project into people both good and bad parts of ourselves. That we are, in effect, that's why she chose this novel as the illustration, accomplished body switchers, as it were. We don't just, if we find ourselves in other people, it's because we put those parts there. So it's a kind of outsourcing, as it were, of our psychic relations and realities.
So would you mind saying more on the interconnection? Because I wasn't clear of how that is eschewed. You mentioned that we seemed to have come to a consensus that it would be that an interconnection is...
Well, that's what I'm going to try to explore now through several models. I'm just putting it out there as a reformulation of what I took to be a consensus. Whether we're drawing stick figures or what have you, we seem to always to have run up to a point where there is a recognition value, even when we throw out something seemingly random. So, in the story by Julian Green, it's the devil who makes body switching possible. Switches that in the course of the narrative come full circle when the protagonist rejoins his dying body in the novel and comes to a close. What he gets from the devil, it's the gist of the contract or compact with the devil, is a formula, as it's put. A formula attached to his first name that he whispers into the ear of the next body, well, the person whose body is now going to be inhabited, switched. So the devil attends a switching that is closely allied to early childhood. Whenever the first name is overemphasized like that, in fact, in the course of the narrative, we only hear about his last name much later in the course of the novel. This is someone who only has a first name, which is how we start out in a sense. It's the name, it's the maternal name, perhaps. And the formula is a kind of baby formula, whereby he's able to enter more and more bodies in the course of getting around and getting away. The name, which is not revealed until the end, as I said, has to, however, be written down on a scrap of paper that he puts into his pocket, so there can be a continuity shot from body switch to body switch, which is an interesting use of the name of the father, just the same. Now, I mentioned the fact that the devil plays a certain role here because I'm going to use occult figures today to talk about different ways of understanding doubling, but also we're considering ways of inhabiting other people, other bodies. Which folds out of the basic notion of doubling, I think. Remember when Schreber talked about soul murder and referred to the pact with the devil as the literary or what have you model for his understanding of what he calls soul murder? He identified that relationship precisely as a way of using the other's person, another person, to extend one's power, one's lifetime, to extend oneself in some way. Now, film tends to be pretty clear about what could be called with Simulacrum 3 empathic coupling or faulty coupling, or what could be called in the more Christian setting, possession. How is the onset of possession, or the onset of a switch, shown in film? I may be wrong, maybe it's not regularly, but certainly very often. Can you think of a film in which such a thing occurs? Fallen, you can think of all the devil ones. But there are others as well. In the 13th Floor, of course, the film that's based on this narrative, Simulacrum 3. There's also the representation of that transition, that moment. Anyway, it's more often than not, I believe, shown by the camera coming from behind and passing through. And when the change is made, we, as it were, stay behind or left behind as the hybrid figure advances. Keeping in mind that the devil right now is attending our thought of possession, of course, as well as of these various shifts and couplings, empathic couplings, as it's referred to in Simulacrum 3. Please keep in mind, I hope it was clear in the excerpts that I made available, that The protagonist, as he becomes aware that he himself inhabits a simulated reality, a kind of laboratory space, the one that he himself thought that he was supervising in the interests of marketing research, as he finds out that he too is simulated, he begins to sense or feel the intent of his operator, and he identifies that operator as a sadistic, insanely sadistic being, something of a devil. So I think we're operating within a certain field here, a field that the devil continues to introduce in various fictions. As we've suggested, the third person in the number 3 refers to, historically, traditionally, to the father, to the agency, which Lacan refers to as the name of the father, the agency that comes between the largely merged parties to the dyad, as to create instead a new order of substitution. But we also say, in a phrase, an American phrase, 3's a crowd. So the number 3 is at a juncture where so much can happen. Because the crowd is something like the father's antibody, the anti-father. It's the anti-couple. It is the closest we come to, after primal repression, closest we come to some kind of rapport with the mother's body. The body of the group is for us somehow maternal. It is what's tempting about it, and why, as we saw before, it serves as a medium of likability.
So can you just say something really quickly about how the novel ends? Because I don't think we have the
Oh, sorry.
No, it's like, I'm just curious.
It ends by his being helped out by the figure Jinx, who in the real world is married to the person who operates him, our protagonist. What's his name again? Hall? Yeah, I'm good with names. So and it turns out that she's visiting also because she's been observing the difference between the simul identity, or whatever you want to call it, and her operator husband back home. He's becoming increasingly sadistic or mad, whereas our protagonist is more lovable. And so at a moment of his extinction, because the operator is going on a rampage, will perhaps destroy the entire simulated reality that the protagonist inhabits, but certainly will yank him. At the moment of yanking, because we've discovered already that the empathic coupling can be experienced 2 ways. She helps him pull up so that instead the operator dies at the moment of yanking. And then there, in the real reality, this is part of the metaphysics that we need to consider, because there is a real reality. Just so you know, in the real reality, people still smoke. This is a trope of science fiction, by the way. I can think of at least 2 other science fictions prior to this one from the 30s and one from earlier 60s, where the future state is separated from the past by the overcoming of smoking. And one of the fictions, kids or someone stumbles into a crypt from the past, where they feel almost as anthropologists or archaeologists, they've discovered the site of a prehistorical cult It's the cult of King No Smoke. So, I don't know where you want to go with that. But what has interested me about no smoking in the past is the way it was introduced in the mode of Gleichschaltung, beginning in California, in airplanes, really. That was the first place where we refused to acknowledge the possibility of segregating smoking from non-smoking. So it does contaminate a lot of trajectories of some of these genealogies. But anyway, there's a point made that they smoke in the real reality.
I have a question about the author.
About whom I don't know too much, but anyway, yeah.
What's that? You might not know too much. What, how do you say his last name?
I do know that, or at least I read it. It's Galui from Louisiana.
And do you know to what extent he's familiar with Freud? Because it seems, I mean, there are even some little things that, if you read them just opposed to what we read in class, like, there was one point, I think in section 8, where he talks about James having a shiny nose, and I was thinking back to that being one of the
Glanz auf der Nase.
Yeah, so I thought, is that sort of a little flag to tell us?
Yeah, but there are other flags too. I mean,
Yeah.
that's great. But the detailed reception of, or presentation of the psychological models that are being used in the fictional realities, I find always being, those presentations are always being made implicitly in relation to psychoanalysis. He has an incredibly detailed knowledge of what I would call the eclectic field of psychological treatment and understanding. Why he chose to focus on marketing research, I'll never know. This is from '64. Of course, it's an ongoing concern, but not necessarily what we would consider the basis of pop psychologization, but maybe. Certainly in advertising, to complete the loop, no matter what kind of psychological discipline is supporting the production of advertising, but it's in advertising where you sometimes don't know if Freud was right or if everyone has read Freud and is just putting it out there. So it certainly is a site of manipulation.
It's also interesting how you get fined if you don't participate in the surveys, so there's a collusion between the private sphere of marketing, the state, who you get fined, and then this economic situation as well, because you get fined. So it gets enforced. It's kind of prescient, like it's sort of freaking out a little to think that he was aware of this, or of things like wire journalism, and there's things in here that you go, well, that doesn't sound unfamiliar at all.
Right. And then what do you make of the move to come up with a simulated world or lab space instead?
Well, I mean, we have that.
Right. Well, that doesn't really change anything. It just means some people are out of work.
Yeah.
It's the same interest in the future of our consumerism. And I agree.
We kind of almost have the two worlds sitting on top of each other with so much market research done automatically by like what you click on online and getting all sorts of free services in exchange for. I mean, in a way, we'd get fined if we didn't want to, subconsciously participate in this market research by having to pay for email or anything.
That's true. I mean, where this becomes at once metaphysical and psychotic, and closer to some of the research we've been considering, is when it's an occasion for the backfire of omnipotence. That's in our lives too, don't get me wrong, but it suddenly becomes the kind of agon in which a certain problem begins because in simulation, another simulation becomes possible. I'm not saying that's far, far away from what you're talking about, but that's where it's not just, let's say, a representation of our consumerism, but it introduces the issue of creativity or creation with a vengeance, with sadism, and all kinds of backfire. Because the end is a kind of retirement from all of this, back to smoking, whatever. When one pulls out of this field of conflict, as it were, it's why it's not terribly reliable, I guess. It's just that so much only becomes legible when he begins to doubt his sanity, when he begins to wonder how it is he, as a pseudo-paranoiac, which is the diagnosis he gets, how he is able to operate just the same under these conditions. The last thing I want to say, I think, or next to last thing I want to say about the devil, or the sadistic operator in this novel, is that the devil, for example, has a kind of elite circle of clients. He only accepts certain individuals, psychopaths really, but perfect psychopaths, into his service, and each one is individually included by contract. But the devil also, and his clients, have a great interest in the mass psychology of cloning, doubling, blanks, or whatever, because it reduces reality, the world, whatever, to a malleable substance that one can control for the sake of the ruling clique. Adorno, not now in the context of the devil, but he mentioned at one point that the mass-produced devil of the culture industry is the mirror image of us as we seem to be viewed by those we believe control us. So we recognize in the devil the prospect of this kind of infernal control of us. Okay, I mentioned, I brought in the devil because for psychoanalysis, the devil only makes sense as a representative of the early father, the pre-edible father, or what one might refer to as the primal father. And one often loses track of that figure. We tend to think very quickly about an edible father, or the failure of that edible paternity. But there is also, early on, another kind of father figure, who is a figure not of adoption, substitution, abstraction, all the things that we tend to associate with the edible father, but the father of certainty. And I hope we'll recognize in this certainty Freud's notion of the first way in which the very young child tends to think about reproduction or creation. It is simply a assumption of psychoanalysis that from the get-go the young psyche wants to know about its origin, but also simply how things come to be, how things are created. doesn't have to be literally reproduction, but what's going on inside the mother's body, to put it in Kleinian terms. How is it harboring the secret of more and more babies? What does that mean? And before we make it into Oedipal precincts and accept, more or less, the reality of reproduction, Freud postulates, beginning in the Wolfman case, that the young child will speculate on his or her own and develop what is called the anal theory of birth. In other words, that creation, second nature, all of the above must come out of excrement, which is the devil's element before psychoanalysis and legend. So that's why I also wanted to introduce the devil here, because excrement is that available model, not just for creativity, but for homogeneity, for a first conception of a kind of doubling and replication, the reduction to sameness.
Wait, can you explain why is excrement creative? Sorry, I don't understand.
Freud even wrote in the Wolfman case that this is where the resistance will be the greatest. Where the resistance will, he anticipates the greatest resistance. It's because the young child already has a relationship to shed. It's something that drops away from the body. Freud also refers to it in the context of toilet training as the gift. The very first model of the gift in the relationship to the mother. And it's what else would the very young child have to work with in trying to understand how creation happens? I'm not saying, I don't think even Freud is saying that everyone subscribes to an anal theory of birth. But certainly everyone goes through the so-called anal phase, which influences one layer of one's relationship to production, creativity, what have you. I mean, that only thus can not only psychoanalysis but pop psychology observe a relationship between preoccupation with money and excrement, which, by the way, is already downloaded in the legendary figure of the devil, because the devil gives money that then turns to shit. And the devil was also already the patron figure of mining, which of course is the primal technology, where one goes into the bowels of Mother Earth to turn that interiority to ore, from ore to everything else that can be extracted from it.
This is something that you see in alchemical and slightly more occult texts a lot, is the notion that within the 7 stages of the alchemical process kind of mapped onto a psychological developmental model that Negredo is the first step that involves the putrefaction of all matter to a simple black base state, which is actually like when matter is at its most potent and creative state. As a babysitter, I mean, I definitely have seen that a lot. There's in different children the impulse to always and whenever the chance is given, usually at a very specific age, to, it's finger paint. It's as soon as there's poop, it's wherever, it's on the body, it's on the wall, and there's the metaphor that a lot of the mothers that I babysit for use that I find really funny when potty training is going on, and the metaphor is always, do you need to go make a deposit? It's like, that's prevalent in at least the middle class kind of environment that I cater to. So.
Just to complete the unsavory story, this primal father figure is thus construed as the figure that monopolizes sexual difference as penetration. Mother, babies, all of them are interchangeable like blanks to receive the primal father's insemination so that the excremental babies can be made. And this is the figure that I see reproduced in this entry from behind in films to evoke perception. But where I'm going with this, because obviously this is one aspect of our relationship to creativity, productivity, to relationality itself. I'm not just saying that we all leave it behind when we make the leap of faith and accept the reality of reproduction, but somehow or other it's part of a rather diversified range of thinking about creation and productivity. And in many ways, the infernal level, what I'm going to call now the infernal level, is very close to a certain relationship to technology as a device for spreading sameness, for treating individuals as interchangeable blanks, for example, whether projected or real individuals. And is very much a part of the creation of what, again, we refer to as second nature, which for the devil is simply excreted nature, because the devil feels that he can control nature once it's been processed, at least once. And that becomes the model of an artificial world, a techno-artificial world. But also, to stick to one of my other themes, it's important to get in touch, Freud suggested, with this early figuration of the father as one of the chores or works of mourning. This is something he makes pretty clear in his essay, the one essay on demonological possession, a case from the 17th century, where he talks about how this painter figure summons the devil, who appears as he paints the appearances as this hybrid primal figure with maternal features and exaggerated phallic features. How this early devil father has to be summoned over and over again in the course of the painter's mourning his father who had recently departed. It might be important in any case, but in the case of mourning the father, it's important because the way the Oedipal father is set up, traditionally and historically, he's set up as prepared to, or triggered to dispose of himself as the very figure of successful mourning. The father is the bearer of the name that will be passed on, and the legacy and so on is already, as one can say, dad on arrival. We live with his death from the get-go. It's a hard figure to mourn. We have to go back to the primal father, embody him, because only the primal father has that embodied relation with us. It's not just a stick figure of the proper name. We have to go back there to mourn him, for example. At least that's the account that Freud gives, interestingly, in this case of he calls it a demonological neurosis.